In this tutorial we're going to have a look at the wildlife of the terrestrial ecosystem. So we're going to take you on a bit of an Antarctic safari, and of course this is all part of the biosphere, plants and animals forming the biosphere. Tourists, photographers visiting Antarctica are really looking for these particular species. You might call them the charismatic megafauna. Things like penguins, seals, whales, birds. These organisms don't all spend their entire lives in Antarctica. Rather, they migrate to Antarctica to capitalize on the food that becomes available in the Southern Ocean, a very productive area in the spring and summertime. So you've got these organisms coming to feed. And then I've also included here the Antarctic toothfish. So there's been some discussion about the toothfish recently. We have a commercial fishery operating in the Ross Sea, and some describe that as the last pristine ocean on planet Earth, and that we shouldn't be fishing for toothfish here. So let's turn our attention to the terrestrial ecosystem. So here we've got the coldest, driest desert on Earth. There's no sign of any vascular plants, and there's no grass, shrubs or trees here. What we find is this interesting pavement, polygonal patterns in this pavement caused by freezing and thawing action of the rocks. The rocks themselves originate from glaciers, so ancient glaciers that melted have deposited all these materials on the valley floor and the valley sides, and these have been weathered, eroded over the years, and we've got a really jumbled assortment of different stones and pebbles here. If we were to look at the soils, there's no organic material in these soils other than the things living in them themselves. So very low in organic matter, no detritus, and very little in the way of nutrients. Despite the lack of vascular plants, we do have 4 types of primary producers. So we've got mosses, we've got some algae, we've got lichens, especially higher up the mountainsides, and we've got blue-green algae, which are also known as Cyanobacteria. During most of the winter months, there is no sunlight for photosynthesis, and obviously it's very, very cold, so no moisture available either. During that time, these 4 types of plant, or these 4 types of primary producers, they'll basically become dormant. They dry up, become dormant, and don't spring into life until the summer months when the conditions become more favourable. This is a photograph that I took showing some moss cover. So you can see the moss here is actually very extensive. It's quite unusual to see so much moss, so this was a surprising find for us. We found this close to the coastal margins where it is more moist, and in fact the soil here would be totally saturated. Now, mosses normally reproduce by using spores rather than seeds, and the spores would blow in the wind and find a favourable spot for them to grow. But that doesn't happen in Antarctica. Instead, the moss themselves blow in the wind, eventually finding somewhere suitable to grow. So this slide is showing some Cyanobacteria, and it grows in mats on the margins of ponds and lakes, and obviously in the little stream beds too. Perhaps a little bit of algae growing here along with the microorganisms, the nostoc as it's called. So these bacteria have particularly large cells. So this is a photograph of me taking some soil samples, and we were collecting soil and putting them in 3 separate bags for 3 separate studies. And we find in this soil that the biological activity is limited just to the top few centimetres. So at this particular site we take samples of the soil, we're looking at the microorganisms living in that soil, and scientists had predicted that there wouldn't be much in the way of microbes at all, and the diversity would be really low. But the studies carried out have shown that actually diversity of bacteria is much higher than first thought. Also at the site we're looking under the rocks for various organisms. So we're looking in the soil, and we're looking under the rocks. So this is what we find underneath rocks. We've got some arthropods here. These are animals without internal skeletons. They have an external skeleton. So we've got a little springtail here and a little mite here. And these organisms again are restricted to areas where there's some moisture. So this is a close-up picture of the mite, Stereotideus molus. It's only not even 1 millimeter in length, and its place in the food chain, it's feeding on algae, lichens and some of the microbes. So this is the springtail, Gomphocephalus hodgsoni, twice the size of the mite, and again, like the mite, same sort of diet, feeding on algae, lichens and some of the microbes. So how does the springtail survive minus 30 degrees Celsius living under rocks in the winter? Well, it's got a couple of adaptations. It basically evacuates its gut, so it spits out its gut, its stomach contents where there would be moisture, so it gets rid of that, and it also produces a glycerol or an antifreeze, so that will prevent it from freezing while it remains dormant during the winter. So in this slide we look at the animals that live in the soil. So one of the soil samples that I took from each of the sites would go back to McMurdo Base, the American base, and scientists would be sampling the soil, looking down a microscope for these 3 organisms in particular. They'd be counting them and trying to identify them to species level. So the nematode worm, probably the top predator. I'll talk more about that shortly, but in a kilogram of soil you might expect somewhere between 800 and 4,000 of these worms. We've got the tardigrade, also known as a water bear or moss piglet. It's got a funny shaped anterior end, front end, giving it sort of a piglet type look. And these are incredible organisms. They're known as polyextremophiles. They're found throughout planet Earth. I think there's about 6,000 species of these, and they're found in the most extreme of environments. Then we've got the rotifer, responsible for eating detritus, the non-living material. Again, like the tardigrade, it likes moisture. So if we think about the soil particles that we have in our soils, in between those soil particles there will be moisture. So we say in between these interstitial spaces, the spaces in between the soil particles, at the right time of the year and in the right place, we'll have these organisms crawling around in that moisture in between those soil particles. Okay, so in most ecosystems we have the top predator, and usually that's a large carnivore. We saw a slide with some killer whales before. Perhaps in the African savannas it would be a lion. But here in the dry valleys, the top predator perhaps could be referred to as a nematode. And it appears that these nematodes, rather than preferring the moisture, like the tardigrade and the rotifer, the nematodes prefer a source of carbon. That's what dictates where the nematodes live. That's the kind of habitat they like. An American researcher has nicknamed her nematode as Rambo. Rambo because it's a pretty tough combatant. And there's a link down here so you can find out more about Rambo and how it's competing with other nematode worms in the environment. And the link here will tell you a little bit more about how important nematodes are in the soil ecosystem, not just in Antarctica but throughout the world. This slide shows Gemma. Gemma basically left school. She finished her NCA qualifications and went to university to do her degree, Bachelor of Science degree. That took her 3 years. So now she's finished that 3-year degree, she's starting an MSc, a Master of Science, and as part of her Master of Science degree, she's setting up these pitfall traps. So what we have is a little trap in the soil, and our pitfall trap is designed to try and catch these little springtails. So the springtail will walk along and fall down into this pitfall trap. So she set these pitfall traps at different sites, and Gemma's trying to find out a little bit about the behaviour of these organisms. So for example, in the summertime it's sunlight all day and all night, so there's no sort of diurnal pattern, there's no day and night cycle. So she's trying to find out when they're most active, and she's predicting that they're going to be most active when it's warmer, and these pitfall traps are more likely to catch the little springtails when they're most active during those warmer temperatures. And when she's collected the organisms in the pitfall, she's just got them under a binocular microscope here to count them. Also got her headphones in as well, listen to a bit of music, I'm sure. So this is Rolf, a German scientist, and Rolf's invented this little device here, and basically what that will do is it will measure the photosynthetic activity of the lichen. So it's got a little sensor here, and that's going to sense electrons and the activity of these electrons when lichen is photosynthesizing. And what Rolf has designed is a little contraption here, a little box with an iridium device which will send or beam signals back to his office in Germany. So that will go via satellite back to his office in Germany, so he knows when these lichens are most active. And Rolf and I are up on this high ridge line here, which is where we tend to find most of the lichens, and as you can see there's some mountain tops there, just kind of showing you perhaps how high up we are. And the lichens are particularly tough customers. So I know that NASA scientists have taken lichens from Antarctica out into space, and they've basically left it on the front doorstep of the space station just to see how they survive temperatures below 200 degrees Celsius, solar radiation blasting it. So even in the vacuum of space, these lichens can survive. A lichen is an interesting organism. It's known as a symbiont, and it's basically two organisms living really closely together. So what I'm trying to represent here are some fungi. So this is a fungi, and the fungi makes up most of a lichen, and it provides this sort of network here. These are fungal strands or hyphae, and living in between those strands are bacteria, microbes. So this is the Cyanobacteria. So the Cyanobacteria will produce some nutrients, some sugars for the fungi, and the fungi give the bacteria a place to stay, a protective place to stay. One of the adaptations that lichens have is the ability to actually grow in rocks, inside a rock. It's thought that perhaps on planet Mars this is where we might expect to find some forms of life. So here we can see a sort of a green layer, this sort of lichen layer in the rock, and this rock's got a bit of a crystalline structure to it, so it allows light to enter through this layer, so that the cyanobacteria can photosynthesize within the lichen. So this is a safe place for the lichen to hide, because as I said before, during those winter months when the winds are really strong, blowing up all the sand, there's a sand blasting effect, and that would destroy many forms of life. So this is a good adaptation to stay out of that strong wind and stop the sandblasting. Okay, so this last slide brings this tutorial to an end. We've had a look at some of the life in the terrestrial valleys. In fact, that is all the life in the terrestrial valleys that I've shown you here, the dry valleys of Antarctica. And I'm just going to refer you to New Zealand tabs, which stands for New Zealand Terrestrial Antarctic Biocomplexity Survey. So it's scientists at Waikato University who are spearheading this research work, and if you want to find more about that, you can click on the link below and learn about the work that they're carrying out.